Hi guys, and welcome to episode 2 of the Barn Quilt Project, the series where I recreate quilt blocks that I see on barns. I found this week's block on a cattle farm in Shelburne called Ruth Prince. The block is much the same as last week's, being a more intricate variation on the Ohio star. The first challenge with this block was deciding what to do about the prince written in the center square. I considered embroidering it on, but I thought that might look odd since the letters were bold and getting them even and nice without an embroidery machine would be a challenge. I then considered maybe trying to find a fabric that was white with some kind of a purple pattern on it, ideally little princes. However, that was a big ask and I didn't want to have to order something online and then wait for it to come in, so I decided the best option was to put a stripe across the center of the middle white square using the same purple fabric I used for the corners and the star points. I think it gives the same color effect as the word, but in a much more simplified way. There was some debate about whether the purple on this block was actually purple or if it was a navy blue. Since the color was dark and it was an overcast day, I don't think the photo really picked up on the true color. Regardless, I decided to poll some people in my life to make my color decision, and purple was the winner. One of my friends said that it had to be purple because it says Prince and purple is a royal color, and I really like that logic. So for the purple fabric, I chose a black fabric speckled with little purple flowers that has been in my scrap fabric pile for forever. Now this truly was a scrap of fabric, and I only had one long strip, which was not large enough to cut any of the pieces I needed, so I had to do some piecing in order to make it work. Definitely not the ideal scenario, but since the fabric is so dark and busy, it does a good job at hiding those seams, and they're not very noticeable in the final product. From this purple, I cut 2 6-inch squares for the quarter square triangles, 2 4.5-inch by 5.5-inch rectangles for the marriage triangles on the corners, and 1 1.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangle for the stripe in the middle. For the red, I decided to go with a more muted burgundy red as opposed to a bright cherry red because I thought it would better complement the purple. This fabric I used is from my recent sewing thrift haul, and this is actually the block I had in mind when I purchased it. From the red, I cut 1 6-inch square for the quarter square triangles and 2 2.5-inch by 5-inch rectangles for the marriage triangles. For the white, I went with a basic white eyelet fabric. I love the way eyelet looks in quilts and how it adds a little bit of texture. This eyelet has the eyelet flowers in straight lines, so I kept that in mind while I was cutting to try to get the flowers evenly spaced on either side of the stripe in the middle block. I didn't worry as much about the placement of the flowers in the other blocks though, and I just kind of went with the flow for that. From the white, I cut a 4.5 by 4-inch rectangle for the middle, which I then cut in half to insert the stripe, 1 6-inch square for the quarter square triangles, and 2 3.5-inch by 5-inch rectangles for the marriage triangles. Also, don't mind the scrap of fabric tied around my finger. I may have cut myself on my cutting wheel. Those things really are sharp. Once I had everything that I needed cut out, I arranged them into the foundation squares I needed to create my block. This is a 9-block quilt design, meaning that the final block is comprised of 9 smaller squares that are assembled to form the complete block. This block features 3 different square designs to create the final image. The first is the square in the middle, which is white with a purple stripe. The 4 squares on the sides are quarter square triangles to create the points of the Ohio star, just like last week, only this time using 3 colors instead of 2. The squares in the corners are marriage triangles. This is my first time sewing this block, so I followed a tutorial by Karen at Just Get It Done Quilts here on YouTube. I'll leave a link to that video down below. She does a really good job at guiding you through the process step by step. I pinned up the first sewing step for each square and sewed them together. For the middle square, this meant pinning together the 3 strips and then sewing along the long edges. For the first step of the marriage triangles, I pinned the long edge of my red rectangles right sides together with the long edge of the white rectangles. I then sewed up that long edge with the 1/4-inch seam allowance. Then, for the quarter square triangles, pinning one of my 6-inch purple squares right sides together with the 6-inch red square, and the other right sides together with the white 6-inch square. I drew a guideline for sewing diagonally up the middle of each. When I sewed these pieces together, I sewed a 1/4 inch from either side of that guideline. Once my 6-inch squares was sewn together, I cut down the guideline I had drawn to divide each of the squares into 2 half-square triangles. Next, I headed over to the ironing board to press open each of the pieces I had just sewn. The white fabric was a lighter weight than my patterned fabric, so for most of my pieces, I chose to press the seam toward to the white. For the half-square triangles that had no white, I pressed the seam towards the red, so that the seams will nest when I sew them together into the 1/4 square triangles. Once the pressing was done on the middle square, it was complete, so I set it aside while I continued working on my other squares. I pinned my half-square triangles together to be sewn into 1/4 square triangles. Since these 1/4 square triangles have 3 colors rather than 2, I needed to make sure to pair a purple and white half-square triangle with a purple and red half-square triangle. And as always, flipping up an edge to double-check the color placement before pinning them together and drawing my guideline on for sewing. Of course, in typical fashion, there had to be something that I measured wrong, and this time it was the red and white rectangles for the Mary's triangles. They were supposed to be 5 inches in length, but I cut mine 1/2 inch too long, definitely way better than 1/2 inch too small. This just meant that I had to trim 1/2 inch off of the end before cutting them in half for the next step. I sewed my half-square triangles together, once again stitching a 1/4 inch on either side of the guideline I had drawn, and once they were sewn together, cutting along that guideline to separate each into 2 1/4 square triangles. For the next step of the Mary's triangles, I pinned each half of the rectangles I had cut apart, right sides together, positioning the red side at opposite ends. After sewing these together, I added a cut in the seam up to the stitch line in the middle. This will be important for the pressing. I pressed open my 1/4 square triangles and was pleasantly surprised that this time they turned out way better than the last time I sewed them, and all of the points lined up perfectly in the middle. When pressing open my Mary's triangles, I pressed the seams towards the white side. That is why it was important to add that little cut in the seam allowance, so that each half of the rectangle can have the seam pressed in a different direction. I made my 1/4 square triangles a little bigger than I needed them to be, just in case I ended up with some wonky edges I needed to cut off, so I trimmed them down to a proper 4.5 inches and set them aside with my completed middle square. To finish up my Mary's triangles, I pinned each of my red and white rectangles right sides together with one of the purple rectangles. On each, I had to draw 2 guidelines to stitch along. To draw these lines, I lined up one white corner with the 45-degree line on my cutting mat. I drew the line along the 45, making sure that it intersected with the corner of the red square. Then, I flipped the rectangle, lining up the other white corner and repeating the process. I took my pieces over to the sewing machine and sewed along each of my guidelines, trying really hard to perfectly intersect the stitch lines at the corner of the red square to ensure that the point perfectly meets the edge of the purple. I'm actually really impressed that none of my corners ended up cut off or floated. Once they were sewn, I cut between the stitch lines to reveal my complete Mary's triangles. I pressed my squares, pressing the seam towards the red and white side, and with that, I was finished sewing all of my foundation squares. With all my squares complete, it's time for my favorite part, laying it all out and getting my first look at how the block is going to look finished. I played around with the placement in this one a little bit to get the eyelet flowers on the 1/4 square triangles all going in approximately the same direction. Once I was happy with the layout, I pinned each row together, double-checking the placement, and dropped them over to the sewing machine. I sewed up each seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Since my machine doesn't have a mark at the 1/4 inch, I've stuck a piece of blue electrical tape at a 1/4 inch, and I think it has really helped to keep my seam allowances consistent for this block. I pressed the seams for the rows, pressing the seams for the middle row towards the outside, and the seams for the top and bottom rows towards the middle 1/4 square triangles. I do this so that hopefully the seams will nest nicely when I sew the rows together. Now is the final sewing step and we are in the home stretch. I pinned the rows together, trying to line up all of the corners before taking it over to sew those final seams. After doing so well for this whole block, this of course is the step where things don't meet perfectly. All of the corners where my foundation squares meet ended up slightly off, but that's alright. It's just one more thing that I can learn from for next time. Finally, it's time to give the block her final press and get her laying all flat and pretty. I really enjoy how this block turned out. It's definitely a busy block, but it feels very classic, like something my great-grandmother would have made. I also feel like I definitely have improved my technique from my last block. I gave the block a final trim to square up the corner and get it to an even 12 inches. I hope you guys enjoyed this block and subscribe to see which barn quilt I make next. Happy quilting!